taking public-private dialogue online. The topic of today's discussion, which focuses on leveraging the digital space to advance business environment reform, seems very fitting against the backdrop of the ongoing pandemic, during which many aspects of life have adapted to by moving online. The benefits of public-private dialogue are many and diverse. Beyond ensuring inclusiveness in the policymaking process, public-private dialogue may also promote public oversight of government action and accountability. Bringing together diverse viewpoints may also contribute to finding innovative policy solutions to development challenges. Most notably, this approach to decision-making recognizes the importance of the private sector's and broader civil society's role in finding viable solutions. Policies which are effectively socialized and reflect private sector input have better odds of securing the buy-in of intended beneficiaries and yielding positive outcomes. They can also help shape policies which deepen economic reform and improve overall country competitiveness. Today, our discussion will center around two papers which discuss the benefits of taking public-private dialogue online. The first paper, titled Public-Private Dialogue with the Use of New Technologies, was commissioned by the DCED's Business Environment Working Group and written by William Nielsen. It focuses on how technology facilitate consultation between government and the private sector on existing policies. The paper rightly notes that there are challenges to effective public-private dialogue, which is only useful to the extent that it's done right. The text highlights the ways in which technology can be used to address these challenges. More specifically, it speaks to how technology can be used to collect public feedback, which informs both remedial and new policy action in line with the broader goal of data-driven public sector. Beyond discussing various feedback mechanisms and their features, the paper features illustrative studies, case studies, identifies major trends and conclusions from these examples, and highlights the role development partners can play in supporting technology-enabled public-private dialogue. The second paper, titled ICT Tools for Public-Private Dialogue in Developing Countries, was commissioned by the European Commission and written by Francois Cassin. This paper focuses on multiple types of dialogue, including dialogue within government, within the private sector, and between government and the private sector. And it discusses how ICT and digitalization can help improve dialogue in these various spheres. It focuses both on direct and examples for developing countries, most notably to bear. The text notably highlights how using ICT for dialogue supports resilience and like the present relevant to the current global circumstances. So I'm pleased that we have the distinct opportunity to hear from the authors. So before we start their presentations, I want to go over the general run of show and some general logistical guidance to make sure the webinar runs smoothly. Each of our speakers will present their paper. Following each presentation, we will have a round of questions for the corresponding presenter, taking us to the top of the hour. We will subsequently open it up for additional questions addressed to both presenters. You should know that questions are sourced both from submissions made before the webinar and audience questions during the event. So if you have a question, please use the question answer function within Zoom to ask, and we'll try to get as many questions as possible. And to ensure that we're able to do this, speakers may respond to some questions directly in the chat window. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to William Nielsen for a presentation on public-private dialogue with the use of new technologies. William is an expert consultant to the World Bank Group with deep knowledge of diverse areas relevant to economic development, including informality, public-private trust, and public procurement. He has often led and/or contributed to DCED research initiatives. And you'll find the link to the corresponding paper in the chat. So with that, thank you, and Will, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Moussa, and thank you all for joining. Excited to have you all here and looking forward to discussing this paper with you all today. So as Moussa mentioned, here we're discussing some new technologies that can be used within the PPD process. And within that, focusing in on the feedback elements of those tools. So gathering information around those pieces. Oh, there we go. Great. So we can jump to the next slide. All right, great. So we will just dive right into the subject here. So within this rise of technology and in PPD, and in particular collecting feedback, there's many tools out there that can potentially be used, many of which I'm sure you're all very familiar with already. So some of them include basic use of SMS-based messaging, email surveys, and they're sophisticated types of needs that can be met. So this may include aspects of online portals that share information regarding a regulatory reform and updates to those reforms, as well as elements of social media communication and online consultation platforms, which at that point may start to include elements of two-way communication as opposed to one-way communication in some cases. And then from there, there's aspects of mobile apps that I'm sure many of you have seen before that can be used specifically for collecting feedback, as well as mobile data collection tools that can be used within the field depending on the audience that you're seeking to reach. And so the use of these tools and based on the literature within the subject is meant to hit on a few of those key benefits. So some of those benefits are aspects such as, increased speed of sharing information, increased speed of the feedback loop itself, so that we're gathering information more rapidly, as well as the potential increased inclusivity of the PPD process. And so as we mentioned, the focus here is on the use of technology within the feedback stage. And we mean that relatively broadly in that, but note that its importance due to the accountability aspect that really comes into play within the feedback stage, as this becomes that point where businesses start to recognize their voices being heard, as well as see how action is being taken. So to give just a brief context of what we mean by feedback, there's, in this case, utilizing the OECD's 5 stages of PPD process, there's a formal stage within that notes the feedback element, and that's the function of that stage. But we also note that feedback is built into all stages within a PPD process. It just changes depending on the type of feedback that is being sought. And so that may inform the type of tool that may be needed to best gather that feedback. And next slide. So as a part of the review for this paper, as you start digging into the different types of tools that are out there and understanding the range of e-government and digital government tools that are being developed, you quickly start to come across a wide range of different but potentially relevant tools within this space. So to help disaggregate and understand some of these different types of tools in play, we note here some of the key distinctions that came into play and were important for recognizing both tools that are potentially relevant and should be considered for a PPD tech process, but also those that may be less relevant, although could in the future be potentially pivoted to serve that purpose. So I'll briefly note here some of these examples. One aspect that was common within the literature review and something many of you are probably very familiar with is elements of online service delivery. This is the type of tool that has been increasingly used around the world, although in some cases we note that its limited functionality in terms of facilitating consultation and feedback is a potential limitation. And so as we're considering tools, we want to recognize the extent that a feedback element is incorporated into that. The next distinction then is looking at whether a tool is citizen focused, and that means, you know, a more broad representation of the types of stakeholders that are participating within a feedback process, but also then those that are business focused. And so for this review, we're really interested in those business focused tools, as those are the ones that will be most oriented towards that business environment reform purpose that we're most interested in. Now, for any of these tools, then there's one last distinction we'll note here, and that is with regard to whether it is designed to collect direct feedback versus indirect feedback. So this one is rather self-explanatory, I think, but just for the sake of discussion, we'll note that direct feedback is those tools where business is intentionally providing information back regarding a particular reform or a policy that's already in place. And this is as opposed to the indirect feedback mechanisms, which may be things that start to mirror elements of like sentiment monitoring, recognizing key issues coming up in the media or within discussion topics within business groups. So the indirect feedback mechanism is one of those that can, in some cases, start to become very data intensive and start to leverage some of these more advanced tools such as machine learning and AI. But so I hope that gives a little overview of the types of tools that we can consider. Next slide then. Great. So within these tech-enabled PPD tools, there are many different features that come into play and are important for consideration as a part of both the use as well as the development of a PPD tech tool. So some of the first ones here we note are, you know, rather straightforward and ones that you would probably expect to be a part of this process. So things like transparency, being process oriented, having a tool that's easy to use. Of course, you want to design a tool in a way that the audience or the business members and the stakeholders that you're seeking to engage are able to effectively and easily communicate the information that is sought. And so that takes into other components of recognizing business capacity, access, so such elements of tech literacy, whether there's sufficient internet connectivity given the types of tool and the potential data transfer that's required for that, as well as some of the back-end elements such as recognizing government capacity or the PPD mechanisms capacity to manage feedback and so forth. So within this, without necessarily wanting to dig into too many of the details here, there's quite a variety of features that come into play and that are important for consideration as you look at these PPD tech tools. Next slide. So, well, we mentioned some of those initial considerations. There's quite a few that are also important here, and we note just briefly, without necessarily running through all of these, the types of considerations that come into play. So one that is an important and recurring theme is recognizing the context of the tool. So whether that's the private sector context, public sector context, country context, the specific project context, all of these have distinct features that are described in more detail within the paper, but for here, we just note that there are questions that are important to ask as you're considering the context of these tools. And so based on that, you know, part of the purpose of the tool must also be assessed, and especially in areas of feedback, we recognize that there are multiple types of feedback that can potentially be collected, and depending on how a tool is designed or how questions are conveyed, that may influence the type of feedback that is gathered. So this may include things like whether you're facilitating the collection of suggestions versus the collection of complaints, or just simply monitoring the effectiveness of a reform, or even in some cases monitoring the effectiveness of the PPD tech tool itself. But so with that, and with any tech-based tool like this, we start to get into questions around the data itself, as data is now being collected. And in many cases, that means data is being stored. And so that leads us into many different questions around how it's being stored, who has access to it, what types of privacy concerns there may be around that, as well as then aspects of how the data is being analyzed. How often is it being analyzed? How are the results of that analysis being communicated and utilized for decision making? So it quickly spirals into many different considerations that really have to come into play. But with that, and we can jump to the next slide here too, it became important as a part of this review to really put this PPD tech into context so that it's not considered necessarily a siloed, separate initiative that's being developed. And so as a part of this recognition of putting the PPD tech into context was recognizing that this fits into this transition from an analog to a digital government. And so with that potential transition, and it comes, slowly in some cases and faster in others, but there is this transition as well towards the data-driven public sector. And with that comes this element of the data value cycle. So as a part of this review, we saw how and looked into how to align this element of the public-private dialogue, which may in many cases traditionally be an analog process, and how that can align with your more data-driven and tech-based processes. So it was interesting to see, and as shown in the visual here, how in many cases the elements are very closely aligned, and the tech tools in many cases can be implemented across, as you see here, the first really 4 stages of the PPD process to help gather information, and then from there begin to store the data, curate the data, analyze the data before then we see the data value cycle and the public-private dialogue value chain, regardless of the structure of it, reunite. And in this case, we get to that point of recognizing or creating the insights that we're really after to drive an effective PPD process and understand the types of reforms that may be most needed and best suited to the given environment. Next slide. Great. And so I think it probably comes as no surprise, but in many cases we start to see that there's various components of value add from incorporating this bigger picture view of the data value cycle and recognizing how it aligns with the PPD value chain. So for example, I'll just note a couple of the top examples here in that, with the tech-based tool, you start to have the potential to reach a broader audience. And with that means crowdsourcing more ideas as a part of what that potential reform may encompass. And as the reform is being developed or discussions are ongoing, the use of the tech tool and the aggregation of data can help facilitate rapid feedback and much more quick understanding of the types of potential changes that are most important. So could be most heavily prioritized versus those that are less important. And then going down the list here, we see that the types of benefits continue across the stage, including, of course, the feedback stage within the ex post evaluation that we've been mentioning here as well, where there's lots of opportunity for analyzing the data and getting really specific types of feedback to understand how well a reform or a policy in place is really performing, and where there's opportunity to reconnect and review what types of dialogue may still be needed to reach the reform required. Next slide. So now that we have this review of both the various types of PPD tech and how they can serve to facilitate feedback mechanisms and how that fits into this bigger data-driven public sector view, we dug into a series of case studies. So here I note some of the main case studies that were reviewed. Won't necessarily dig into the details of all the content on the slide here, but certainly if you're interested in any of these, happy to discuss following this webinar, as well as there's more details within the paper as well. But here, I just note some of the kind of key distinctions that came through within some of these case studies. So along the top there within the tool row, you see some of the key types of tools that were in play. So in many cases, consultation platforms are a tool that have been more widely adopted, especially in some mid to high income countries. We see those being increasingly used, but also other types of tools such as feedback surveys. In some cases, they may be more of a periodic or an annual tool that is not specific to a given reform, but meant to generate feedback in general, as well as some more sophisticated app-based tools, but then also some that are very specific in their function. For example, in the Kyrgyz Republic, there's a great case around an email-linked web-based survey that was specifically for businesses following an inspection. So you see here the range of potential tools, the sectors and functions that they operate within can come in many shapes and sizes. So there's many potential insights and learnings that can come from deep dives into these case studies here. So next slide. So to summarize some of the key takeaways that came from these country case studies, we'll just note that, broadly, I think it was widely regarded that PPD has some very significant opportunity to be supported and facilitated by technology. However, it was a recurring theme that the tech itself was not necessarily the be-all end-all solution. And in some cases, it was easy to blame the tech for any instances in which the PPD process did not seem to function as smoothly as would be hoped. And so with that comes this idea that we mentioned earlier on too, but just that this context element is really important within the PPD tech space, as there are many different considerations that have to come into play to really get the tool to function as needed. And in some cases, that lack of accounting for context can really lead to limitations in terms of buy-in from all sides. That was one of the leading obstacles that really came through within the different case studies, as well as the literature more broadly, was just if the tool is not something that is really required or is easy to work around or is so drastically different from the way dialogue had occurred previously, it may be that it is often ignored or not used the way it could potentially be to leverage the change really desired. So as well, within these case studies, the direct feedback mechanisms were certainly the most commonly integrated tools within this space. So elements of the surveys or consultations that really sought out businesses to understand how a reform was functioning. But we note that this tech tended to work within the less intensive levels of public-private interaction, and specifically this is areas of informative and consultative, which is just to say that in some cases it may be that the tool is structured to share information or to pull information, but not necessarily to really dig into that next level of public-private interaction, which would be that dialogue level, two-way communication that would often be sought. So this is just to say that the PPD tech tool, it may not necessarily be, in many cases today, be something that's going to fully replace all analog PPD processes, but it can serve as a strong supplement in many cases and be a way to collect data and develop analyses that supplement other aspects of the PPD process, so that there's really informed and evidence-informed decision-making occurring. Next slide. So getting real briefly here, I know we're running on time, but role of donors. There's several elements here that came into play within the literature that we note here just real briefly. So this includes elements of when considering implementing a PPD tech tool, recognizing what digital government initiatives already exist may help to identify those areas where you could start expanding the scope a little bit more. So if something is already connecting with businesses and government, it may be that incorporating a feedback element into that more explicitly could be readily accomplished. But similarly, there's recognition of existing analog PPD process that may be readily supplemented through a tech-based tool as well. So consideration of that may also then help support the sustainability, which is an aspect I think many of you are familiar with in terms of the donor engagement process. And that just will help serve to facilitate the long-term functionality of that tool, as well as create opportunities for donor exit while still allowing for the potential expansion of that tool. Next slide. So lastly, just note some of the research needed in this space. It became apparent within this literature review and engagement with different stakeholders that there are still many things that are unknown within this space. In particular, the evaluations of these tools are often very limited or focused on just a few types of outcomes, such as potentially increased visits to a website or number of reforms that have gone through a consultation platform. So in many cases, there's opportunities for a more robust assessment of both the potential successes that have come into play, but I think more importantly, in many cases, recognition of the obstacles that have been apparent and have potentially limited the use of a tool in place. Next slide. Great, and that will conclude my presentation here. Thank you all very much for your participation, and I'm excited for your questions.
Thank you so much, Will, for such an informative and very relevant presentation, touching on what PPD is, on tech-based tools used to facilitate PPD, the value added of using such technology, and some great considerations like data privacy, which governments need to account for. And also for identifying trends. I'm sure that we're going to have some questions for you from our audience. So I'd like to invite anyone who has questions to use the question answer feature within Zoom to ask your question. And if needed, I'm also happy to call on individuals who would like to say their question out loud to the group. But I guess I'll start off with one of my questions. Are there certain contexts that have the greatest potential for implementing tech-enabled PPD? And how can we tell if it might be appropriate to actually move towards tech-enabled PPD at this specific time based on that context?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think, so just recognition again of that context element is something that was really important within the cases reviewed, as well as a recurring feature within the literature. So there's several different contexts that are noted as being particularly important that build out within the paper as well. But some of those aspects that came through as being potentially signals for the appropriateness of the tool was recognition of just what's already in the space. So what are businesses potentially already familiar with? And so that next step, so whether that's something that's already a part of, it could even be just their traditional business processes, but now creating this channel into a PPD process using a tool that they already use. I mean, just considering the use of some of our video communication tools, recognition of if there's a platform that a business is already familiar with and comfortable with, leveraging that same platform for this other exchange of information may be well suited to a new PPD tech engagement. But with that comes other aspects of context that in some cases start to supplant that. The element of trust is huge within the space too, where just because a tech looks to be well suited and aligns with the digital literacy skills of all stakeholders involved, if there's lack of trust between the parties communicating, it may be that no matter how well designed the tool is used, it's not going to be something that folks are interested in using. And so in which case there's aspects of building trust start to come into play, and recognizing how sharing information can serve to facilitate growth of trust. And so that aspect of the feedback tool rather is a point of, I think, a lot of potential interest in something that is it's being developed within the literature, and in some cases is more theorized rather than empirically based, but elements of closing the feedback loop can serve as a way to facilitate growth of trust over time. And in some cases that may be just kind of baby steps in terms of recognizing that your voice is being heard and some change occurred as a result of that closing of the feedback loop there. So there's, I guess, lots of potential considerations that come into play, but those are some of the big ones that were apparent.
Thanks for that. Well, I think particularly important things that you mentioned is just kind of this idea of building trust, and interestingly also just the very last bit that you mentioned there as well about the idea of, you know, the user just feeling like they're being heard as well, right? Because it creates an environment where obviously you're communicating through this digital platform, right? And maybe you're not seeing a policymaker eye to eye, but you still feel like you're being heard, that the information that you're providing is going somewhere, and that there is going to be some level of positive action taken based on that. And then I guess I had a question for you just about the various case studies that you reviewed, and whether you think that there's one in particular that stands out in terms of country example of a country having done a particularly good job of moving through the cycle of basically transitioning from analog to the digital tech-enabled PPD space, and kind of the obstacles that appeared or that seemed more prevalent either for that country or across the various case studies that you reviewed.
Yeah, sure. Well, the cases certainly varied quite a bit, maybe more than I expected at the outset of this project. But with that came this assortment of insights as well too, so that in some cases the tool was something maybe a little more siloed in its approach, but with growth and expansion plans built into the pilot project. Like within the Kyrgyz Republic example noted, it was the development of a tool to help improve the connection between business inspections. And so with that, it was launched as a pilot, but meant to eventually expand so that all inspectorates would be using this tool and gathering feedback from the businesses that they have just inspected, so that there's both, as we mentioned, this increased trust potentially and what that can mean going forward. But, I think in that case too, that it became also an obstacle of the buy-in as well, in that while you may be receiving the email linked survey following your inspection, then the step to then open that survey and go through was something that a lot of folks were not necessarily all that interested in pursuing. And some of the initial reasoning behind the development of that tool was important for consideration too, as I believe within the Kyrgyz Republic, they noted within that case how the very high percentage of businesses that are receiving inspections. And so this, in some cases, the use of the tool and the desired result did not seem to be connected in any way. And so even through continued use of the tool, it seemed it was generating information, but not necessarily driving a change that I think both parties were potentially interested in fostering.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Will. So we do have some questions coming in, and I see them. Some of them I'm actually going to save for the second part of this discussion, where we'll get to speak to both you and François, because I think they're relevant to both papers. We have one that's come in from Goran Ranek, Thank you, William, for the presentation and study. It's interesting and very much needed. Have you maybe identified design principles and policies for digital tech solutions to increase the trust and uptake in providing feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some very interesting papers out there that are geared towards the design of tools, and it's not necessarily specific to a PPD tool, but more often just a user experience type tool or type literature, where we start to understand how the design of the tool can help engage folks in different ways, so that it's both, elements of user friendly, of course, but also is potentially fun to use in some cases, or is just so easy to use that you don't have to think twice about potentially providing the feedback, especially if those are in some cases very like light touch feedback tools, like really quick rankings, or thumbs up, thumbs down. In some cases you see like the smiley faces or the friendly faces as being a quick way to just 3 questions, do the quick smiley face ranking, and you're done and move on, so that the tool is easy to use and doesn't appear as a burden in some cases. Let's see, and to the second part of the question, just wanted to touch on that. Oh, I might have lost it.
I think you answered the question.
Okay.
So once again, I don't want to gloss over anybody's questions, but we'll come back to some of these questions because I am mindful of time and will here in the question and answer feature. I do see some interesting questions coming in. I want to let you know, John Clifford, Suzanne Reichenbach, I'm not ignoring your questions. I just think that they'll be better suited for after the discussion with François as well. So with that, I'm going to pivot over to François. Thank you again, Will. And we'll turn to our second presenter. Francois Cassin is a sector engagement expert. At the Trade and Private Sector Development Facility. He specializes in private sector engagement and has deep knowledge of investment, climate, and trade issues, with particular focus on private sector development in Africa. François' paper is in the final phase of review and publication is forthcoming, so be sure to look out for it. François, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Moussa. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we hear you fine. Thank you.
Excellent. And good day to everyone. So I'm Francois Cassin. I work for the TPSD facility managed by DAI for European Commission International Partnerships. And we develop knowledge, and we also provide technical assistance to the EU and also the EU delegations, especially to support the implementation of the EU External Investment Plan. So this paper was developed, was drafted, especially in the context of the COVID-19 and as a follow-up of a note that we also published on private sector engagement during COVID-19 times, in which we discovered that PPD was accelerated during COVID-19 times and also could benefit from ICT tools. So together with the European Commission, we wondered how can we review all tools that exist and contribute to support PPD and also business environment reform at large. So as opposed to William's presentation and paper previously, this paper is more general since it covers tools, ICT tools, and all spheres where ICT tools can be useful to support public-private dialogue and business environment. We have theoretically 3 spheres of communication for business environment reform. We have the internal communication sphere that covers the communication and interactions within trade unions, within private sector organizations, and within public sector organizations such as mini departments and agencies. We fear of interest dialogue per se. So those are the interactions, direct communications between the private sector and the public sector. And then finally, we have the third sphere, which is the general public, and also that also touches the role of the media, that is, according to us, quite important when we want to strengthen the business environment and through PPD. Next slide, please. So the idea, again, this is quite conceptual, but I'll try to illustrate this with specific examples in the next slides. But the concept here is that all those spheres of communications, they are interconnected, meaning that the internal communication within private sector organizations, within the public sector actors, and within trade unions, if they are reinforced through the use of ICT tools, can also be beneficial indirectly to strengthen the PPD by improving its inclusivity, by improving its effectiveness, and also make the PPD better informed. Secondly, of course, the public-private dialogue is improved, as William has demonstrated, through the use of ICT tools, and this has positive effects on the internal communication and also on the external communication with the general public. And finally, the external communication can be enhanced through a higher awareness of the public about PPD processes and also more broadly about economic development related issues, which increases legitimacy and adherence to the reform process, and also can put pressure on government to really act and engage in a reform process and adopt reforms that improve the investment climate. Next slide, please. So the first sphere that we cover here is the internal communication. Here, there are many areas where ICT tools can indirectly support public-private dialogue. For instance, within private sector organizations, ICT tools can be used to serve pure communication purposes through electronic newsletters, through virtual meetings between private sector organizations and also between the private sector organizations and their constituents, of course. Also, ICT tools can be used to strengthen the internal governance of private sector organizations. In the paper, I illustrate this issue by presenting the case of Benin, the Chamber of Commerce in Benin, that has organized electronic elections in 2020, so that 5,000 members of this Chamber of Commerce could participate. This really importantly increases the legitimacy and also the inclusivity of the Chamber of Commerce. Also, financial management, membership development, and fundraising can be enhanced by the use of ICT tools, such as CRM systems and also fundraising, online fundraising campaigns. This improvement of financial management also leads to a greater sustainability of private sector organizations, which is really important to sustain public-private dialogue. Also, service provision by private sector organizations can also be supported by the use of ICT tools. This is the case, for instance, of KEPSA, which is the Kenya Private Sector Alliance in Kenya, an apex body that represents the private sector in Kenya. And they have shown that during COVID, they could develop a broad range of e-services for their members. For instance, they have developed a resilience toolkit that allows businesses to adapt and mitigate the crisis and navigate the crisis. They have also developed training modules so that their members could through the website Jumia and their e-commerce platform, sell their services and products and then better cope with the crisis. Also, very importantly, ICT tools can be used to improve business advocacy. And this was also demonstrated during the COVID-19 crisis with online surveys that allowed to assess the economic and social impact of the crisis on various sectors and demonstrate to the government the importance of adopting mitigation measures and recovery plans. Also, more systematically, many donors and organizations such as the Danish industry and GIZ have implemented programs that equip private sector organizations with a systematic way of evaluating the business environment perceived by the member companies. So those are called the business barometers. It's a systematic way of evaluating the perception from businesses about the business environment and systematically communicate to the government and engage the government with facts. Another element, another area where ICT tools can be useful is to advance on decent work conditions. And various projects, especially in Southeast Asia, have proved that the use of ICT tools and very simple systems like IVR, which are interactive voice response systems, so systems that directly, systematically, automatically answer phone calls, and also SMS-based applications, etc., can be useful to advance and to raise awareness about the working conditions, the labor rights among workers in factories, especially in the garment sector. This is very important to inform the workers about their rights and also evaluate the way these rights are respected by the factories. So those two projects that I cover in the paper, that I speak about in the paper, were implemented by the ILO, for instance, together with the IFC in Cambodia. Also, and still speaking of the internal communication sphere, we speak of G2G, which is government to government. And we refer here to e-governance, which facilitates cross-agency cooperation and also enables real-time and informed decision for ministries, departments, and agencies. Why? Simply because using ICT tools for governments, it allows for a better and informed decision-making process, and so it also strengthens the confidence from the private sector towards the public sector. Next slide, please. Now, related to public-private dialogue, this is also a part which was covered by Will Nielsen's paper. But what we can say here is that the use of ICT tools directly reinforces PPD, of course. At the diagnostic phase, we have seen, for instance, in Nigeria, that the Nigeria Economic Summit Group has digitalized its engagement with the government, and also that KEPSA, the same organization in Kenya, has used virtual meetings to engage the government during COVID-19. But we also see an interesting initiative that is implemented by I4 Policy, which is an organization based in Rwanda, a Pan-African forum that is made up of innovation hubs that advances and supports the adoption of startup acts through a co-creation process, which is based on the organization of policy hackathons. So virtual meetings that engage both the public sector and the private sector, mostly startups, that wants to create an enabling environment for startups, especially in the tech sector. Regarding implementation, this function is mostly ensured by the PPD Secretariat and refers to the internal communication between public and private stakeholders. So it goes about dissemination of policy briefs, coordination of PPD website, online forums and repositories, etc. Regarding now the monitoring and evaluation process, Will Nielsen has covered the importance of ICT tools to collect the private sector feedback on the policy reform process and also monitor the implementation of the reform. So I will not speak more about that. Next slide, please. Finally, the last sphere of communication is, according to us, of great importance for the success, the inclusivity of PPD. And it covers the general public information, meaning the awareness of the general public of the reform process, and more broadly about business-related issues. That area, the general public awareness, can be strengthened by the media. And there, also international cooperation partners have a key role to play. For instance, in Zimbabwe and also in Nigeria, projects implemented by the DFID, by now FCDO, have both components. They play on the interactions between the public and private sector, but they also try to strengthen the way the general public is informed by the local media about business-related issues. So basically what they do is supporting the development of business journalism through radio programs that are the most frequently used media in the grassroots level. So those projects have proven that through raising awareness of the general public on business-related issues, you can in turn increase pressure on the government side to adopt reforms and implement them, and also improve the general investment climate. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways of this paper that will soon be published are that this paper presents how ICT tools can directly and also indirectly support PPD and business environment reform. Secondly, that ICT tools can support business environment reform by improving exchange of information related to business-related matters internally, also between public and private actors, and also externally with the general public. And we believe that these spheres are interconnected. Finally, donors have a role to play in each sphere of communication, and the paper does try to illustrate this with many examples, 16 case studies in the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, François. That was a great presentation, also with many relevant examples from Africa and related to the ongoing COVID-19 context. I think particularly interesting is the coverage of internal and external dialogue, both in the intra-private sector space and the intra-government space, and how they can be facilitated using ICT. I think it's also great that you touched on how these tools can be used by the private sector to put pressure on government or hold government officials accountable for delivering on planned reforms. So with that, I do want to turn back to questions. I have a question myself for you, just about what you can tell us about PPD practice more generally or broadly in Africa. But I think that question aligns very well with a question that we also received from Edmund Soko, which reads, is there a PPD tech platform designed for a specific region like Africa? And I think what this question really alludes to is whether there's a sort of toolkit that maybe exists for certain developing contexts. So if you have anything in particular that you can share with us, or any thoughts, that would be great.
So regarding PPD in general in Africa, this is something that we have done in the context of the TPSD facility and to support the European Commission, especially their strategy on the Sustainable Business for Africa platform that aims to support PPD in Africa to improve the investment climate. So we have mapped out PPD processes at country level in 50 countries. And the most important results are that PPD is quite widely used, quite widely present in Africa. In most countries, there is a formal PPD established by law, but it is not really efficient. The efficiency is quite low, and especially the inclusivity is very low. So there are many actions to implement to support both effectiveness and inclusivity of public-private dialogue in Africa. Now, regarding a regional platform on PPD, I am not aware, but there are various initiatives such as the Eye for Policy that I mentioned. This is a Pan-African initiative to advance on startup acts and improve the enabling environment for startups to operate in various countries in Africa. So they have done those policy hackathons and co-creation processes in Rwanda, in Senegal, in Tunisia, now in DRC most recently, and they have a Pan-African purpose. This is it.
Thank you very much again, François. I want to turn, because you mentioned exclusion, and this is something that came up that was specifically mentioned by John Clifford in the chat. There is a danger in the use of technology of exacerbating exclusion and disadvantage. For example, the lower access of women to technology in Africa is well documented. And so since you referred to exclusion, and obviously this question does as well, do you have any thoughts on how you guard it against such exclusion in these contexts?
Yes, the question of exclusion also touches the informality question. The informal sector has a triple burden, especially during the crisis. It is by definition disorganized. It is not structured and cannot speak one voice to the government. The second issue is that the informal sector and the marginalized categories are also the most hardly hit by the COVID-19 crisis. And the third one is that in all public-private dialogues, the informal sector and marginalized categories like women entrepreneurs, youth entrepreneurs, and people with disabilities are underrepresented in these PPD processes. So in the paper, we also present various initiatives that aim to support the expression of the voice and the collection of feedback from marginalized communities in remote areas, in rural areas. And this, you have limitations when you want to use ICT digital tools. But there are other methods that can be used, such as radio programs that I mentioned. In Nigeria, a DFID project was very efficient in emulating a debate with the marginalized categories, and also a GIZ project in Ghana has done that with the northern communities to involve them in development planning so that they could have a voice in building hospitals, building schools and water wells, etc. So basically, you should resort and use even more basic tools such as IVR systems, interactive voice response systems that present both the advantage of that they are cost-free, it's free of charge, and also that they can overcome the language barrier and the literacy barrier that you have with SMS-based applications, for instance.
Thanks again, François. And I think one final question for you before we open it up for questions for both presenters. And I think that this question serves well to provide us all a little bit of a recap of some of what you covered, because I think that Suzanne Reichenbach was a bit of a clairvoyant in thinking ahead to some of the questions that were answered in your paper. So they ask one question on intermediaries. How do you see their role? Because on the one hand, they can potentially use technology themselves for their own consultations, e.g. A chamber consulting their members, but also participate in digital PPDs with public sector. Not sure where to make the differentiation here in the process. And I think you kind of did a good job in your paper of talking to what we said earlier, the kind of intra-private sector and the intra-government and where the overlap is. And I was wondering if you could give us just a little quick recap or you know, in answering this question of those two distinctions.
Yes, precisely. The general concept of the paper, it is at conceptual level, but I try to illustrate this with practical examples. So basically, within the private sector, ICT tools can be really beneficial, can be useful to strengthen their sustainability, financial sustainability, so that because they, for instance, they better understand through surveys, they better understand the needs of their members, they deliver e-services, digitalized services. They also can improve communication with their own constituents, which improves their legitimacy in the eyes of the members. They can also, as you mentioned, engage with the government, with public bodies, etc. So there's a broad range of ICT tools that can support the sustainability, legitimacy, and also the evidence that the private sector brings to the government to advocate for reforms. Do I answer to the question?
I think so. Suzanne, please feel free to let us know if you have additional questions or follow-up questions related to that. Feel free to drop those in the chat. So now with that, I want to thank both of you for your presentations, François and Will. And I'd like to turn to questions for both presenters. I'll let you know, our participants drop their questions, continue to drop their questions within the question answer feature. But I think just a general broad question that I think will help to kind of recap some of the overlap in your papers. Why do you think digital technologies are specifically supportive of business environment reform? So this is a general question for both of you. And I'll start with you, François, and Will, feel free to jump in.
I believe that this, again, to come back to the COVID-19 crisis, I believe that it has shown that the ICT tools can bring many benefits, overcome, travel limitations, social distancing, etc., accelerate the collection of feedback, reinforce the way the proposals, the reform proposals are evidence-based and well-informed, and sometimes increase the inclusivity, add pressure on the government side to adopt reform and move and improve the investment climate. So I believe, according to me, there are many ways through which the ICT tools can be beneficial to improve the business environment reform and specifically PPD.
I'll echo Francois on that. Many of those are the same types of benefits that came to my mind as well. This element of incorporating more voices through the use of technology is one that I think is appealing to many folks. Certainly has obstacles to be able to effectively achieve that, but the potential is definitely there. And this element that Francois mentioned as well, with the speed with which you can begin to start collecting information, and with the back-end capacity to process that information, if that is in-house and sufficient, you can really generate a lot of insights rather quickly.
Thank you both. I have a question here as well from David Irwin. And I'll open this up to both of you, although it came just shortly after your presentation, François. It seems to me that one of the biggest problems is not the mechanisms that might enable dialogue, but rather the lack of competence and experience among the business organizations and potentially the trade unions. It appears that those organizations that are able to gather and present independent and objective research evidence and prepare policy positions with reasoned and compelling arguments are more likely to succeed in securing policy reforms. What can be done, therefore, to build the competence and capacity of business associations and trade unions so that they are more effective? And I'd like to broaden this question as well, beyond the private sector, because obviously this focuses a lot on the private sector, and to include you as well, Will, in responding to this question. But also, I imagine that there must be cases where governments launch an online PPD process, and there isn't necessarily full capacity developed for the staff who are supposed to respond to that. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd welcome that as well. So whichever one of you wants to answer that question first.
I'll start, Moussa. First, I know David Irwin personally. He's a great expert, and he's worked many years for DFID projects and Danida's project in Tanzania and Kenya, and he knows well the business advocacy issues. So he knows what to do with private sector organizations. Maybe he can answer this question, but I can tell you that those projects have sought to strengthen those private sector organizations' advocacy capacities with the 5-step approach to business advocacy. It is not only supporting these to produce evidence-based material and advance reforms, but it goes also about capacity building, because business advocacy requires some mentoring, some coaching, so that private sector organizations see business advocacy not just as a one-off intervention, but more as a campaign. And they can also plan their engagement with various public sector actors. They can also plan their engagement with the media again. And so it is a whole strategy. They can also be supported to collect more revenues and so be more financially sustainable. So there's a very broad series of interventions that can target private sector organizations and support ultimately their business advocacy function. Maybe David, you want to answer your own question?
Yeah, David, I'd like to invite you also, if no pressure, but if you would like to speak. I think that was a great question to get all of us thinking more broadly about how the private sector can be engaged internally in dealing with some of the issues that it faces. So if you would like to speak, please let me know. And Will, in the interim, if you have any specific thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly on to what Francois described in that, and with regard to the PPDs in particular. I think when there is that capacity in the PPD process to effectively collect and manage and analyze the data, that in theory in some structures that should serve to help reduce the burden on those private sector entities that don't necessarily have the in-house capacity to create evidence for themselves to build their own case, so that we're kind of aggregating the data and the evidence into the PPD mechanism itself, and helping, I suppose in this case, lift up voices of those who have less private sector capacity to manage that. I see David may be able to join too. Oh.
There we go. I think we have David on screen here. David, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. What I was really wondering, Francois, Will, was whether you've come across particularly effective uses of technology to help with some of that training. So yes, you're right, Francois, I've been doing lots of training over many years. And until this time last year, it was all, physical in-person type of training. and we're all struggling to come up with innovative ways of being able to do that online, use the technology more effectively. And so whilst I might have lots of experience of doing some of the dialogue training, Francois, what I'm really lacking is good innovative ways of using the technology so that we can do that from a distance.
I can't, I don't have any answer to your question, David, sorry.
I think all the same, it's a very good brain teaser for us to be thinking forward about in this space, right? In specifically bringing to head this idea of distance learning, David. So thank you for bringing that up, and for leaving us all with something to think about going forward. I do have an additional question for the two of you. And I just want to open the question function here. This question comes from Mattia Tomei from the OECD. Thank you for the insightful presentation. Do you have insight on how tech tools change the role of facilitators in the PPD process? For example, making them more or less relevant, changing their responsibility, etc. Thank you. So if you have any thoughts on that, the various facilitators of PPD and how their role changes as a function of this transition online, do let us know. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on this, Will or François.
I can jump in briefly. I think that's a really important question. It's one that I don't have a great answer for, and it's something that wasn't coming through a lot as a part of our review. I'll note one example, though, was just with regard to the use of potential like a PPD delegates almost that serve to support the data collection through the use of a tool. That may be through a mobile data collection tool, in which case though, in many cases, this serves, or this individual is often traveling around and gathering this data for the use of then later analysis that could inform the review process. So that would be one example that comes to mind of how that could change, but definitely something worthy of digging into more.
Thank you, Will. François, any thoughts on this? And no pressure.
I agree with Will, and I have nothing to add to that.
Perfect. I have a great question that's come in from Ines Escudero, who might be a colleague of François. So excellent presentation with down-to-earth examples. Thanks. Now, if you are a government and want to encourage PPD and use the PPD data, how do you decide which one to use? What happens if different apps show different contradictory recommendations? There's a wide range of programs, as you have shown. Governments are sometimes lost about what to use and when. And I think this is a great question. So thank you so much, Ines, for submitting it. And I'm wondering if the presenters have any specific thoughts on this or have encountered this in their research.
It is true that you can use the statistics the way you want. It is, and this is valid for not only ICT tools, but statistics in general. So, it requires honesty on behalf of both public and private sector. Public and private actors should agree on a methodology to collect feedback from the private sector also, and a way to present the data, according to me. I don't know, Will, maybe you want to add something to that.
Yeah, no, I think that point you made there is super important with just, the presentation of findings and showing where there's different results or contradictory results, and making that clear to the stakeholders participating within the PPD will be important. And so that from there, you could have a more well-rounded conversation about what the real steps and actual reform will then look like. Yeah, that's a great point too. I don't have a specific example with regard to that to describe though, but it's certainly important.
Thank you very much. And one final audience question, and potentially one question from me. A question that came in from Ekanath Katiwada. I guess, how is the public sector incentivized to apply PPD in your view? And I think let's take this question a step further. How are they incentivized to make the transition from the analog process to the online process?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one here. So I guess one of that initial contextual factors is recognizing that the incentives are aligned in the first place, which in some cases that were reviewed as a part of my paper, we noted that it wasn't necessarily the case, and that in fact public sector folks were not necessarily interested in using the tool, or there were various workarounds developed so that the tool could be ignored, such as the use, let's see, I'm thinking of the example, there's special caveats that could be put into place such that the consultation platform is not necessarily required for passing a reform. And so in that case, it may be more that the incentives are aligned for the private sector, but not necessarily the public. And then with that, I'm bringing all the negative examples here, but another aspect that comes into play and is something that may be important in different contexts is just the potential influx of negative feedback that may accrue as a result of these tools. If many private sector stakeholders have access to participate and share their opinion, and that opinion is often negative, there's now a risk on the public sector's part to manage that feedback and what they'll do with that feedback, or if and the extent that they'll be publicizing some of that information as well. So recognizing some of those contextual factors will help potentially manage the alignment of incentives so that all participants are equally supportive, or more or less supported, to developing a successful PPD process.
Thank you so much, Will. That's a great answer to the question, and gives us something to think about as well. And one final question, I guess, is just about the intermediary steps for countries that are or localities that are transitioning from kind of an analog process, or trying to leverage these digital or tech tools. In your view, what do they really need to think about in this transition, or what's the top thing that they should really prioritize? Obviously, I think, Will, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about just enabling legislation, but is there something in particular that you think that governments or donors should in particularly support in leading to that transition? So if you have any thoughts, I'd welcome them.
Yeah, it's tough to nail down a sufficient summary for this one, but it's super important. And I think this aspect of buy-in from the outset, and how donors may be positioned to help recognize where different incentives are situated for the different public and private sector entities, and create that recognition and shared communication for how developing this PPD tech tool may be to benefit both parties involved, as well as then this recognition of creating a tool that is structured to potentially expand, and not a siloed pilot that has really no room for growth. So those two aspects come to mind.
Thank you very much, Will. François, I think you wanted to speak. I'll let you go ahead.
Yes, according to me, what should be encouraged are those interventions that support bottom-up approaches. And so strengthening private sector organizations, improving their internal communication with their own members, enhancing their capacities to collect data, to formulate evidence-based policy reform proposals, also improving the general awareness of the public about business-related issues such as business formalization, such as complying with taxes, obligations, and also their rights, social rights, and also fiscal rights are important elements that are more bottom-up and that could enhance pressure and incentivize governments to then engage with the private sector and discuss constructively. To come back on the last question about the incentives, I believe that governments have the first incentive is, collecting voters, getting some votes from the local populations. So if the local populations are more aware of the constraints of their rights, of the duties, etc., if it's made in a transparent way, then it will add pressure on governments to really engage with the private sector and adopt reforms.
Thank you very much for those comprehensive responses. I want to say thank you again for such amazing presentations and sharing your work with us. We're excited to know where this will head in the future, especially given the current context, as I said before, where we have to make all sorts of adaptations to moving online. So thank you also to the attendees for their great questions and for being such active participants. Special thanks to Simon White, Jim Tamburn, and Ella Duffy, who are really responsible for the organization of this entire webinar, and more broadly, this series that we are presently implementing called Building Back Better as part of the Business Environment Working Group's work. So we have an entire series of webinars that follow under that theme. And I encourage everyone to stay tuned and to continue to tune into our webinars. With that, thanks again to Will and Francois, and I encourage everyone for more information on the DCED and specifically the Business Environment Working Group to visit enterprise-development.org, which is our website. Again, thank you very much for such an active discussion, and wishing you all a great day or good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. Thanks again.